Well, welcome everybody to our online program on addiction and recovery from the Sunshine Coast Health Center up here in Powell River, BC. And for a topic, we'll talk about different ways of interpreting addiction. Recently, there was this article in the Huffington Post by this fellow who, although it doesn't appear that he had an addiction problem, certainly there was people in the family, and he's had relationships where addiction's in. So he got very curious about this, and he spent a lot of time, traveled around the world apparently, and wrote a book on it. But he wrote an article about his research in the Huffington Post, and he gave this really interesting title to the article. He called it "The Likely Cause of Addiction Has Been Discovered, and It's Not What You Think." So I thought that was kind of interesting. So reading the work, reading the article, what the author is talking about was this idea that maybe it's not so much the effect of the drug on the person, but maybe addiction has got to do with the environment and the way that society looks at people with addiction. And for those of you who have been clients at Sunshine Coast Health Center, you would have heard a lot of this research. He talked about Bruce Alexander's Rat Park. He talked about Dr. Lee Robbins' Vietnam studies, which indicated that the environment had this profound effect on the addiction. So that was quite interesting. And it's this idea that's actually growing and collecting more and more evidence. Now, I found it kind of interesting that Rat Park and Dr. Robbins' studies are decades old, and there's some much more modern stuff. But it's this idea that, again, we've talked about it before. For example, it's kind of interesting that if you're Irish American, you have 7 times greater chance of becoming an alcoholic as an Italian American. So that's like, how do you make sense of that? So under this new way of thinking, they would say, well, culture has a great deal to do with that the alcohol, wine particularly, is steeped in the Italian culture and has been forever. And maybe this is the deciding factor. We know many other things. We know, for example, a former professor at Harvard University, one of the fellows actually who was there with Tim Leary and Richard Alpert. He told me about his experiences in Fiji, and the Fijians drink this concoction called kava kava, and they were doing pretty good with it. There was no addiction problems. No one was passed out in the street. No one stumbling around until the white people showed up. And what the white people did is knock out the ritual. And once the ritual under which this drug was taken was knocked out, all of a sudden, addiction problems started springing up. So that's kind of curious, eh? That it's because what on earth has a ritual got to do with the addiction? But it's this idea that the environment actually has this profound influence on whether addiction takes place. And there are many other examples. One of the ones that started it all off was from Dwight Heath, and purely by accident, he ran into E.M. Jelinek, who was running the Yale University Alcohol Studies program. And Jelinek and some other people knew that Dwight Heath had been to Bolivia and were studying this group of people known as the Camba. And they started grilling him on the drinking habits of the Bolivian Camba. And it suddenly dawned on Dwight Heath and his wife that they had actually been part of this, and they were drinking this incredibly potent alcoholic drink regularly, and yet it dawned on them that there was no addiction, and no one's stumbling around. And so this was quite fascinating. How can you have an entire group of people imbibing, and I think it was 180 proof alcohol regularly, and yet no alcoholism? So these are the kinds of research findings that were beginning to emerge now that we start looking around the world at different cultures and start asking more probing questions. So anyway, this is what this article was all about. And it's a new view of addiction, or relatively new, and it's growing in power. As I mentioned, Rat Park has been resurrected, even though it was done in the 80s. I hear more and more about Dr. Lee Robbins' studies on the Vietnam War veterans, where they simply gave up the heroin when they came back home. And that was done in the early 70s. So a lot of these things are now being resurrected. So we can see this movement towards, yeah, maybe the environment is playing this dramatic role in whether an addiction exists. Anyway, that's it for this program, and we'll be back next time with another episode on this views of addiction.